Welcome to this event. I'm very happy to introduce Eddie Stack, who will be giving a reading. Before I introduce Eddie, let me just say very quickly, so we'll have, Eddie will read and answer some questions after he does his reading, and then we're going to have a reception and music down in 330, which is right down at the end of the hall, okay? And so I hope you'll join us for food and wine and beer and music. Eddie Stack is a lecturer in the Celtic Studies department here at UC Berkeley. He teaches classes not exclusively, but primarily in modern Irish. He's the author of 3 short story collections, The West, Out of the Blue, and Queer Hawk, as well as a novel called Heads, and a volume of 3 novellas called The Irish. He also has a really fascinating CD project from the West, or with stories from the West, that's accompanied with music by Martin Hayes and Dennis Cahill. He's won an American Small Press of the Year award. He's been named as one of the top 100 Irish Americans by, I guess, the magazine Irish American, or a different magazine. And he's appeared in many anthologies and many magazines throughout the world. And of course, his most recent book, Doolin, People, Place, Culture, has been out since late last year, mid last year, and he will be reading from that this evening. So please welcome Eddie Stack.
Thanks very much, Eric. It's the fairies.
Yeah, it's a
Our friends are here. They know it's the season and they follow me around, and there's absolutely nothing I can do about it. So thanks, Eric, for the introduction, and thanks to Celtic Studies, UC Berkeley Irish Studies Department of English for hosting this event. And to me, anyway, I would say this: it seems a proper way to celebrate St. Patrick's season. So first of all, I just want to say a few words about Doolin. Doolin is a small area in northwest Clare. It's between the Cliffs of Moher and the Burn. And these are 2 places of stunning beauty. I suppose it's about maybe 30 square miles, and you take out the lakes and the bogs. And up to the 1970s, it wasn't on any road maps. And maybe that's one of the reasons that helped preserve it as a sanctuary of Irish culture. In ancient times, it was called Tuathlé, and it was a statelet ruled by the Clay branch of the O'Briens. Some of the earliest shore dwellers in Ireland lived there about 5,000 years ago. And the area has been inhabited ever since, so there's a massive amount of ancient monuments and of various sorts there. In 1841, a few years before the Great Famine, it had a population of 2,700. And today, the population is about 650 to 700. So that's quite a drop. It's an area that's noted for music, storytelling, dance, and song. And we have evidence that the earliest music played in Doolin was around the 8th century. And we know that from bronze harp pegs that have been found there and have been dated by the National Museum of Ireland. It's the nearest point of the mainland to the Aran Islands. And Doolin was the last Clare Gaeltacht. It survived as an Irish-speaking community until the early 50s. And I really think that if it had survived for another 20 years until kind of my generation were, I suppose, more conscious of the richness and the value of the Irish language, it would have a vibrant Irish speaking. It would be a vibrant Irish speaking today, but unfortunately that didn't happen. So I'm going to read some pieces about the Irish language, and they segue into the storytelling tradition. And I'll start with a man called Paddy Fáric Whitehill Shannon. He was the last native Irish speaker in Doolin, and he was the most fervent believer in fairies that I ever met. He was a most amazing character. I have a chapter on Paddy Forrick-Weichel, and it's called The Way We Were. So here we go. A slight man with twinkling eyes, cap sideways on his head, Paddy Forrick-Weichel was the last native Irish speaker in Doolin. He lived alone in a small thatched cottage behind O'Connor's pub, about a half a mile or so from the sea. Paddy's cottage had a flagstone floor and was sparsely furnished. In the kitchen, an old brown dresser displayed a few willow patterned plates and jugs. And by the window, there was a small table covered with a yellow oilcloth. The whitewashed walls were bare, apart from a Carmelite sister's calendar and a picture of the Last Supper over the hearth. Above the door, small rush crosses from Fela Brige were brown from smoke and age, and they lined the edges of the ceiling. Heat came from a huge open fireplace, which was about 6 feet wide, with hobs on either side. A small, scruffy cat slept on one, and an old black kettle was on the other. In the grate among the turf always glowed orange-red. This was the only light in the kitchen, as Paddy had declined the electricity, and his most modern appliance was a small battery transistor radio, eternally tuned to Radio na Gaeltachta. The following is from conversations that we had over the years. Sometimes they were in Irish, other times a mix of both languages, Irish and English. And the Irish sections here have been translated into the English as Paddy spoke it for the purpose of the narrative. So here's what Paddy says. When you think about it, sure, English is new around these parts. 'Twas all Irish that they spoke in this village and around when I was young. My father and mother hadn't much English until we went to school. They learned most of the English that they knew from us, sure. The Irish was spoken here in Fisher Street by the people the longest. Of course, it was the language of the sea and fishing and going in and out to Arden. We had more use for it, sure, than the people in the country. That time, in the summer evenings, women and children would gather at the river wall down in Fisher Street, and all the talk would be in Irish. After a while, someone might sing a song in Irish, and that's how the time was passed while we waited for the fishermen to come home from the shore. It was a pity the Irish ever died out. An awful lot was lost. All the old songs and recitations, and of course the stories. These will never be heard again. And all the shanachals or proverbs and cures and prayers and things, these are all lost now. And what's more the pity, because they were very useful. Names are gone for things, and there's things now, and there's no names for them in English. But of course, Irish wasn't seen as much use if you had to leave here. And sure, back then, when I was young, there was someone going to America every second day. Times were hard. That was the saddest thing about those days. All the people who had to leave, God help us. Most of them never returned. They had big going away nights, but they were very sad too. Now, Paddy lived from 1916 to 1992. And here's a sidebar from his chapter. It's called Death of a Language. And, you know, in the length of time that Paddy Forrick-Weichel was alive, I don't believe that any Irish government took any constructive steps in policies or regulations or whatever to really foster and to stem the decline of the Irish language. And I'm going to read here about some academics and their experiences of the Irish language around Doolin. In 1926, Irish was the everyday language around Doolin, and the area was deemed a Gaeltacht, or Irish-speaking area, by the government. But English was making inroads, It was the language of commerce, and many parents considered it the first step to a better way of life for their children. Scars of the Great Famine, centuries of colonialism, the realities of immigration made English seem more progressive, practical, and desirable. In Clare, bit by bit, the transmission link was weakened, and little of the old language flowed down to the younger generations. In 1929, when Seamus Delargy of the Folklore Society of Ireland came to Doolin to collect stories, a good number of the native speakers were still alive. Delargy was highly impressed by the quality of their Irish, which he thought was the purest that he had ever heard. He wrote, "It was Irish which for richness of vocab and wealth of idioms had few rivals. The dead words on a manuscript page are a poor substitute for the haunting beauty of the language which lingered and died on the lips of my old friends there." Delargy thought that the storyteller Stefano Hilra was the finest Irish speaker he had ever come across in Ireland. And in 1936, he arranged for Stefan and other native speakers to travel to University Galway and have their Irish preserved on shellac discs. In that same year, writing about the townland of Luke in Doolin, Harvard anthropologist Conrad Ansberg says, "Its language, at least of the middle age and older people, is Irish, but the young are forgetting the old tongue. English is more common speech here today." Now, when Niles Homer surveyed the Irish dialects of Clare in 1946, he had only 22 informants in Luke and 14 in Fisher Street. So that's 36 people that he had. As the older generation passed away, the number of Irish speakers got fewer and more dispersed. And it was only in Fisher Street, where they lived close to each other, did the speakers make up any sort of community. The passing of the old language was accompanied by a decline in the oral traditions associated with it. Nights of storytelling got fewer, and in a matter of decades, centuries of myths and wisdom disappeared into silence. A survey carried out by Heinrich Wagner in 1951 and 52 noted, "In Doolin and Fisher Street, Irish is on the verge of dying, although most of the older generation still speak it. English has become the vernacular of the younger generation everywhere." By the 1950s, the Gaeltacht boundaries were redefined to reflect the true use of Irish in regions. And the old Clare Gaeltacht was given a Brack Gaeltacht or bilingual status. Fisher Street was the last community of Irish speakers in the county. And today, it has no native speakers, though many can speak the language and it is cherished. And in English speech, Irish words and idioms still colour conversations. And when the Aran Islanders come ashore, we hear Irish in the local pubs and in shops. And on the top of Donegal Mountain, a red light blinks at night. On the radio in the Gaeltacht, the mast that relays programmes from Connemara down to Kerry. It's like as if it's signal that there's still an ember in the fire. So I'm going to move on now to Seamus Delargy. Seamus Delargy came down to Clare in 1929, and he wrote, "I was determined to go to Doolin to see what I could find there. The ordinary, everyday speech of the commonality, up to 1929, had never been committed to writing, and the oral literature and traditions preserved in Clare in the Irish language had been ignored, or their existence was unsuspected." So he travelled down from Dublin by train and bus with his luggage and a heavy Ediphone recording machine. He hired a car to bring him from Listonvarna to Doolin, and the inimitable Patchin Murty Flanagan got him lodgings with the Carey family in Luke. Irish was the everyday language of the Carey household. Catherine Carey was from Inisheer, and her husband Johnny was a fine speaker of Doolin Irish, who happened as well to be a fine storyteller. And Delargy spent 5 weeks with them. And he set up his Ediphone machine on the kitchen table. There was no electricity, so it was battery operated. And as soon as he got there, he was recording the Irish-speaking tradition pairs. The first piece of Doolin folklore to be published appeared in Bailey's number 2 in 1929-1930 edition, and it was collected from Johnny Carey. And De Largy wrote later in the Irish Storyteller, "One of the finest Irish speakers I met there was a certain Sean O'Caroon, or Johnny Carey. He was about 70 years old, a man of keen perception, who readily understood the object of my visit. Some months later, I learned from his wife that when he was not to be found, he had gone to a cave in the mountains above the house to wrestle with his memory, striving to recall tales which he had heard from a native of the Aran Islands some 40 years before and which he had forgotten. He returned in triumph with 3 of these tales restored to their home in his memory, and I wrote them down." So De Largy came back to Doolin at Christmas of that year, and he again lodged with the Careys. And it was during this second visit, and almost completely by accident, that he met Stefan O'Hilra, a gifted storyteller, but about whom nobody had said a word. Actually, nobody knew that Stefan O'Hilra was a storyteller. That in itself, he was a shy man, but anyway, De Largy gives a vivid account of the occasion in Maloney's house on the 3rd of January 1930. "Anthony Maloney had arranged for us to gather in order to give me an opportunity of getting acquainted with some of the old Irish speakers whom he specially selected as being likely informants and service to my work. I paid for a bucket of porter, fetched from a local pub. There was a good fire blazing in the hearth. The sky was covered with frosty stars, and the faint murmur of the sea seeped in through the doors. A memorable night of storytelling followed, each old man giving it his best. Anthony kept order, but the people themselves were so interested that they listened with great attention and in complete silence to the songs and stories, which lasted for 5 hours. This was the first time I met Stefan O'Hilra, who proved to be the best Irish speaker and storyteller I was to meet in Clare, and he was the line of the evening. Stefan, at this point, was 72 years old. He had never told a story in public, and this was his debut. And himself and De Largy became great friends. And over the years, De Largy collected over 150 stories from Stefan, as well as Shanachas and Irish vocabulary. Now, in Doolin, De Largy collected several different types of stories, tales from the Finiacht, hero and voyage tales, tales of magic, tales about historical figures, and even a love story or two. And some of these stories came from the Aran Islands, and more came from Brandon and West Kerry. More of them, there was no notion of where they came from. And De Largy likened the world of the Doolin storytellers to another hidden Ireland, a place so rich in folklore that it had few equals. And yet its importance was more appreciated at home or abroad than at home. And that's quite true with all the international academics that came. A good many of them were German. And it was kind of, I suppose, poo-pooed in Ireland. I don't know, but anyway. And De Largy believed that the Irish oral tradition had vast amounts of unnoticed information on the social life of the ordinary country people, and that it could be a vast new resource for historians. And he says, the only real authorities on Irish tradition are the storytellers. They belong to a different world from the commentators. And even the best equipped collector must cultivate academic humility and a feeling of respect and reverence for these exponents of the ancient lore. So back he went to Dublin, and the following summer he returned again on August the 2nd, and again set up base in Carey's house. And he was there nearly 2 weeks when Stefan came to him one day and told him a version of a well-known folk tale called Conall Gulban. And this tale took over 2 hours to narrate. The Largy had never heard anything as good before. A magnificent story that showed Stefan as a first-rate artist. And it was recorded on the Ediphone at Carey's on August the 26th before an audience of 17 people. And 20 years later, the Largy would say, it was the finest tale I'd ever heard before or since. And one of the things was that when the Largy would record his stories, he'd go back to Dublin with the Ediphone. And the stories would be transcribed. The Ediphone, unfortunately, would be shaved down for reuse. There were wax cylinders. And then the Largy would go back to the storytellers with the transcript. And when he went back with the transcript of Conall Gulban to Stefan, he was amazed that there wasn't one word of a difference. And Stefan told the story again, and the Largy went through the transcription, and there wasn't one word of a difference in the story. And that to me was incredible. It was kind of like, wow. It took 2 hours to tell. I mean, if you repeat a sentence, a long sentence, you won't repeat it. Anyway, that was Stefan. So, in 1932, in August again, he made his third expedition to Doolin, and he collected more tales and more folklore from Stefan. And he was in Stefan's cottage in September the 11th, and he wrote, in the house with Stefan and myself are Patchin Flanagan. Patchin was actually a relation of ours, and another character. He could take a book of his own. Johnny Carey, Seamus Maloney. And Stefan has been talking about the fights he took part of in the old days of the cattle driving. Stefan is one of the finest Irish speakers I've ever known. It will never be possible to bring back the language the way he speaks it, and how little attention is now paid to these fine old speakers by the stupid talkers of today. And that's a kind of a dig from the Largy, like to these, I don't know what you would call them today, but they're not what we would call fear Gael goers anyway. But they still exist, and we meet them now and again. Anyway, his last meeting with Stefan was in 1943. And when it came to saying goodbye, there were tears in both their eyes, as if they knew this was for the last time. And Stefan clasped the Largy's hands and he said in Irish, if you're here the night that I'm waked, I'll tell you a story. And he died the following year on the 4th of May. He was buried the following day. And a week later, the Largy received a letter from Doolin, dictated by Patchin Flanagan and written in Irish by a neighbour. It was one of the very few letters that Patchin had ever written. And it began, I'm sorry to be telling you that our soft, sweet Irish storyteller, Stefan, is buried. May the Lord have mercy on his poor soul. And the Largy wrote, Stefan was the best Irish speaker I met anywhere in Ireland. It is a great loss to modern Irish scholarship that no Irish linguistic expert ever made a study of his marvellous expressions and his equally rich vocabulary. He had hundreds upon hundreds of words and turns of phrase that were found nowhere else in Munster. I was the first stranger to appreciate his stories and to listen enthralled to his inexhaustible flow of untrammelled Irish, which up to then no pen had recorded. When his name is mentioned in Doolin by the Bay, They'll talk about his craft, about his magnificence as a storyteller, about the funny habits he had, about the turns of phrase. I collected from Stefan, with the help of the Edifone, enough tales to make a lovely big book, if the collection is ever put into print sometime. And that book was published after De Largy died, actually, and it's called Laur Stefan O'Hilra, the book of Stefan O'Hilra. And it's a monument to the storytelling tradition of Doolin. And I've written somewhere that if County Clare ever needs to kind of restart its psyche, that this book should be part of its liturgy, because it's really, really Clare. Now, De Largy visited over the following years, often with Maura McNeil, a colleague from the folklore department. He called on old friends who were still alive, and he said a prayer at Killila graveyard for those who had passed on. Johnny Carey was the last of the storytellers, and when he was bedridden in 1955 at the age of 95, De Largy visited him. It was an emotional parting, both men failing to hold back the tears. And Johnny took his hand in the old manner and kissed it. And De Largy wrote, I've said goodbye to the man from whom I'd written down the first folk tales in Irish in North Clare. And I'd said goodbye to the old world of which I've been privileged to be the 11th hour chronicler. Thanks. So, anybody want to ask any questions?
Why do you think none of the linguists ever went there to, were there just not enough linguists, or, you know, and you said Stefan was a shy man.
Yeah, well, there's probably a couple of reasons. I mean, one of the things that struck me was, why didn't any of the Gaelic revival people visit there? That was one mystery. Now, I have my own theory about that, because Augustus John and Francis McNamara, they're two characters, they're in another chapter of the book. They were very friendly with Led Gregory and Yeats. Augustus John was Robert Gregory's best man at his wedding. And Augustus was the first person to put anything in writing about the Doolin traditions. And he wrote in 1910 about going down to Connors' pub to listen to the old sagas in Irish and to the Irish music and song. So they would have been aware of it. But the thing was that Augustus John, Francis McNamara, and the Bloomsbury set, they holidayed there before the First World War. They took part in the culture. Like Francis was, he was the son of the local landlord, but he was seen as, the Irish have a strange kind of a thing, like Francis was seen as almost a leader. You know, he was seen as a traditional kind of a chieftain. So they had that mass and that respect for him that they didn't have for his father. It's inexplicable. But he was a person of the people and he knew Irish. And reading about the kind of exploits that they had with the natives, Yeats and Lady Gregory would run 10 miles from that. You know, like they would go in and out to the Aran Islands in currachs and bad weather and have poaching and be dancing and shouting and roaring. And that was not the kind of thing that Lady G or WB were into. So Doolin was out of the picture for them. As far as the academic were concerned, I think now some of Celtic Studies people here would have their own, could add to this. But I think that you know, there would have been few academics in Ireland interested at that time in folklore, and maybe more of them in the Irish language. But if you look like at the people who did the main surveys of the Irish language, who recorded it for posterity, who recorded the dialects and that, they were all either a German or Norwegian or Swedish. There weren't any budding linguists that I've come across that are mentioned, like Irish guys. So to me it was a kind of a mystery. Like this was one of the Gaeltachts that kind of fell through the cracks, in a way, you know. Like you had a big concentration in academics going out to Connemara, even going to the Blaskets, and you know, the Aran Islands. The funny thing, like, is like Singh passed through Doolin. He was a guest of Francis McNamara's, but I think it frightened him, because this is this was real stuff. Like, you know, if anybody's been to who here has been to Doolin? Okay. The culture there is very much alive, like in the music, and it's wild. Not to us, but it's wild to others, you know. And I'd have a feeling that much of it, like much of the history, like in regards to the Gaeltacht and that, like that Gaeltacht just died. Now, while the Gaeltacht died, the storytelling tradition went with it, but the form of expression came out in the music. You know, like the songs and stories didn't cross the language frontier. I counted at the most 10 stories. From the Largo recorded a total of about 500 stories in Doolin, and I counted 10 at the very most that crossed the language frontier from Irish into English, and they were by the same family. They were told by the same family, and they weren't. I mean, there were great stories, but I checked them out against Stefan stories. Like, I checked the English version against the Irish version, and there weren't. Well, I'd say this anyway. I think that they weren't as polished. They weren't as polished in English as they were in Irish, and so there were certain changes, like whether it be even changes in the title. Like, one of them was Madra Dovna no Gus in Irish, was the black dog with the 8 legs. And in English, it's called the black dog of the wild forest. Go figure. So anyway, yeah. Any other questions? Sorry?
I had a question about the maps. You mentioned the obscurity of the area and how the name Doolin didn't appear on the maps
Yeah.
for a while. And when we started going there in the 70s or 80s, there was Fisher Street and there was Doolin, and it might be one or the other. So I wondered about the relationship between Fisher Street and Doolin, which are side by side.
The district is known as Doolin. And you know, there's 42 townlands in that. It was the ancient statelet of Two Clay. And there's 42 townlands. And we can account for every townland. You know, we can say, well, you know, Tirganen is country without a bird. Luke is because there's a lake, etc., etc. But nobody knows what Doolin means.
Well, that's great.
I really think it is, you know. Even the Logamnica, or the Place Name Commission, kind of says meaning unknown. Could be
Dark lake.
a dark, yeah, but that is that's kind of comparing it with Dublin,
It is, too close.
which wouldn't make sense down that end of the country. One of the things that to be my own theory, and a bit too radical to put actually in the book at the time, was that it came from Dubh Killeen, which would mean a black church. And the reason why I thought that was that it had some connection with the Vaide Meldoon. Because the Vaide Meldoon started from one of these areas, because there's the black church mentioned in the first few hundred words of the Vaide of Meldoon. And that's why it had to do with Meldoon's mother. And it was from there, if it was from there, that would make sense. I came across a reference to that it might be Dubh Killeen, but I couldn't find the damn reference again. It's just one of these. There's again another Doolin mystery. The thing as well, why the area was actually called Doolin was because in the townland of Doolin was the seat of power. That was where Boris McClancy had lived, the infamous Boris McClancy, and that was where the McNamara's eventually lived. So that gave it the I suppose the area took its name from that. The way some people would still call it Two Clay, like the older people, and they would call where do you know that where the church was the new church, as they call it.
Yes, that's it. On the high road.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But that was the site of the McClancy Law School back in medieval times. But the old people will call that Two Clay Church, Shapel Two Clay, because it was so synonymous with kind of like the McClancys and all that. Yeah. It's Tony, yeah.
Just a quick question. As you made your way through this research, what effect, if any, effect is the wrong word, what influence, if any, did the fact that you come from this area have and on the behavior?
Well, I suppose the first thing is that I'm very connected with that area. And we've a lot of family there. And like my family mentioned all in the book. So what effect did it have on me? I suppose the main effect it had on me was when I was in my late teens, that I realized, you know, there's only maybe 3 Irish speakers left here. You know, like when I was younger, I remember, you know, maybe a half dozen of them would come into our pub down in Estymon. And I remember this, I must have been really small, but I remember this, they're coming in with men from the Aran Islands, and I'd been brought out to meet Anthony Maloney, who was mentioned there. And I remember being really scared when I saw the Aran men's pamputis. Because pamputis, like they were like 4, you know, kind of like I'd never seen that before. Doolin would have been my home from home, and it was my dad that introduced me to Doolin. His aunt lived right down on the water. There was a little house down by the pier. You might have seen it if you were down there. That was my granddad's house. And so my dad had relations there, and my mum had relations. My mum's relations would be the Flanagans, like Patchin, and she was related through the Flanagans to the Russells, who were famous musicians. So, you know, I suppose I came from the next parish, and I had I didn't have to have an introduction to the place. But when I realised, you know, it's kind of like, God, you know, this place is really changing when you're down to just a few Irish speakers. And I started jotting down little things. The idea of a book wasn't in my mind. It was more or less an innocence that maybe I could preserve something that was being lost. And actually, the book part of it only became a reality when I started teaching here in Berkeley. And there's a number of reasons for that. And I think that I was in the right place with the right colleagues, and there was a support system, even though I didn't tell anyone who was writing it, of course. But there was an unspoken support, and then my mate Louis arrived, and that clicked it up a gear. Plus, one thing I discovered was that a Berkeley email address is gold. Because if you are writing to Oxford or Cambridge or UCD or something like, you know, and your Gmail, yeah, you know, you write with a Berkeley address and your little tag down at the bottom, Celtic Studies, they'll respond to you, and they'll be really nice, and they'll give you leads to other stuff. So all that kind of coalesced when I started writing, when I started working here. So thanks very much to Celtic Studies and the man who interviewed me there, Gary. Thank you very much. So any other questions? Barney?
Can you say just a little more about what's in the book, or some of the stories in the book?
Sure, yeah. Well, the book opens with a sort of a socio-cultural history of Doolin. That's people, place and culture. That takes it along up to the present time. And then the next one is the way we were, it's Paddy Forrick Weichel, which is really getting into the Irish language and the whole way of life that was there. And then there's a rather big section called the music makers, because today Doolin is known as really a mecca for Irish music. So this the way the music makers has a chapter on the Russells, which is a rather big chapter. Another chapter on the Killoughurys, another musical family, and a chapter on the dancing. And then there's a chapter on the storytellers, and then I have a chapter on the gentry. And the reason I have a chapter on the gentry was that up to a certain point, the old Irish gentry were really the patrons of the arts, and this kind of starts with the guy who said, "No, I won't be a patron of the Irish arts." He was a Brehon lawyer. He was one of the McClancys. And when he came to be head of the McClancy family, now they had a school of Brehon law and poetics from the 8th century. And he became the head of the family in 1560 or something like that. And they were the Brehons of Thomond, the head Brehons. So no legal document was valid in Thomond, North Munster, except the McClancys had gone through it and had signed it. Now, to have that amount of power in such a remote place back then was something else. And he really he paved the way for English law in Clare. He dismantled Brehon law and paved the way for English law. And he was so he closed down the school. and he played a prominent part in the bad stuff that happened when the Spanish Armada went aground in 1587, whatever it was. And then the other gentry were the McNamaras. And the McNamaras were an ancient Clare family who had been evicted by the Crumlin forces, and they made their way, they clawed their way back from Ballyvaughan in North Clare down to Doolin and down to my home place in Steinman. And they, the son, this Francis McNamara, he was a bohemian. He started studying law, and after a year dropped out and announced he was a poet in Chelsea. Yeats thought he was the finest speaker in Ireland. So he published one book, and he got led astray to all sorts of things, and he was juggling affairs and all sorts of stuff. But he was really good to my dad. My dad's father died. My dad was young. And Francis was really good for him, and he gave my dad, as my dad used to say, the place of a rabbit. He gave my dad the place to keep a rabbit, a pet rabbit. He actually bought him the rabbit. So we had a sort of a family connection with Francis. The thing about Francis, one thing is, do you know, anybody ever see a film called Saving Mr. Banks? You know, P.L. Travers. She was Francis' lover. Right? And P.L. Travers wrote Mary Poppins for Francis McNamara. And yeah. She thought that he'd divorce his wife and marry her. And his wife died. But in the meantime, he was having an affair with one of his daughter's friends. So instead of marrying P.L. or proposing to her, he married his daughter's friend, which was a disaster. And it was a disaster for P.L. as well. And he moved, and they were out of contact until she got in touch with him. Now, she was fierce wealthy at this time, and Walt Disney was looking for the rights to the film. And P.L. Travers said to Francis she wanted to adopt a child, but the child had to have good Irish genes. So he had a solution. There was the daughter of a poet who had had twins, and she was putting them up for adoption. And fine, she said, and she was coming over to Dublin to bring the two babies back. But before she left London, she consulted an astrologist. Wasn't you, Mary? No. Anyway, she consulted an astrologist who told her just to take one of the kids, which is what she did. And it really destroyed the rest of her life and the life of these two kids, who met by accident. She wasn't getting along with the guy that she adopted. And I forget what year this was, when his half-twin comes to the door. And he says, "Who are you?" "I'm your brother." And they went on an unmerciful binge. And the guy she had adopted was a friend of Michael Caine's, the film star. So the three of them made a fair old dent in London. Yeah, anyway. All right?
Well, on that,
Thank you. Thanks very much.